In this video, I am going to go over the notes that you will want to put in your journal to remember some important details about the Syrian civil conflict or Syrian civil war, the Syrian refugee crisis. The reason we want these in our notes is because the main character in our book has connections to Syria. She grew up in Syria. She has family who still is living in Syria during the time of our novel. And just kind of knowing what was going on in Syria at that time and even what's happened very recently in Syria helps us to understand some of the events in the story. So our story is not set in Syria the whole time. It's actually only in Syria for a small part of the story, but I still think it's really important that you know what happened in Syria impacted our main character's life, but also impacted real life in America for Americans and Syrians and people of the Muslim faith. So your notes will say Syria side-by-side Pear Deck and in Schoology, and the page something notes. That page number might be different, so make sure you're checking in lesson 2 for that page number. You want the template, and I planned on showing this together to the whole class, so we took notes at the same time. It does not matter if you do it before or after the Pear Deck, but my intention initially was to do it after the Pear Deck. So as I'm going through this slideshow, you are going to want to take notes, and specifically, you only need to write down what I have highlighted. So, first of all, in 2010 through 2012, a series of uprisings and demonstrations against governments of several Middle Eastern and North African countries occurred simultaneously. This wave of civil unrest and resolution is known as the Arab Spring. So you would write down a series of uprisings and demonstrations against governments of several Middle Eastern and North African countries. And then you would write down the wave equals Arab Spring or something like that. In general, the demonstrators wanted political change, honest leadership, and oversight. So their problem was with their government, with their rulers. They wanted economic opportunity and fairness, and they wanted basic human rights and freedoms. So largely, they wanted a better quality of life, and what that required was opportunities to make money, opportunities to be treated fairly, and a government that wasn't going to take advantage or mistreat them. Here's a map. You don't have to write anything down, but here's a map of Northern Africa and the Middle East. So Syria, this blue one up here, is where our story is going to take place. Syria is right next to Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq. And you can't see it here, but Israel, Palestine is here. So this is where our story is. But again, all these other countries had some sort of political, whether it was a revolution, a civil war, protests against the government, different scales of people taking issue against the government. This was 2010, 2012, a really big event that was happening in all these places. And obviously, all these places are their own country, so they had different rulers and governments. During the Arab Spring, more than a dozen countries had political uprisings in only 2 years. Why do you think that is, and what could it mean? Complete all 3 sentence starters below. So these are on your note sheet. So political uprisings spread quickly because. Political uprisings spread quickly but. Political uprisings spread quickly so. So thinking about the fact that there were so many of them, this is what people wanted. And here's a map of what happened, all these places. The stretch of land is so much wider from east to west than the United States. These are huge countries. pause to answer. I'm going to actually kind of move on. So I'm not going to complete these sentences for you, but I do want to tell you some of the things that may have been causing this. So this was the start of Twitter. Twitter came out, I want to say it really grew to popularity in like 2012. And Twitter was worldwide. People could update their Twitter statuses constantly. It was the first social media platform that you didn't need to be friends with someone or like them to see what they were posting. So it was this huge active space where people were speaking what was happening in their lives. The news media started covering Twitter a lot more. We just, as a whole world, became a lot more aware of what was going on in other places around the world. And other places in the world became aware of what life was like other places too, for better or worse. Political conflict in Syria. So this is another heading on your notes. What to know. So again, you're only going to write down what's highlighted. Syria was ruled by one family from 1971 to 2024 under a strict government. So, one father and son. The father started in 1971 as the president, and then in 2000, when he died, his son took over, and he ruled until just actually December of last year, of 2024.
Okay. I found this on the web for who was ruled by one family from 1971 to 2024 under a strict government.
So my phone is responding. My phone is responding because I said Syria and it thought I said its name. Anyway, okay. People who disagreed with the government often faced threats, imprisonment, or violence. Protests began with many rebels wanting a democracy. So protests began against President Bashar al-Assad. He was the son who took over in 2000, but you can just say protests began with many rebels wanting democracy. Democracy is where people vote for their leaders. And then there are rebel characters in our story. So we will have rebels and protesters in our story. Extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL also joined the conflict but had different goals. So these groups would have been against the government as well, but they wouldn't really be for the same goals and outcomes as the protests. They didn't necessarily want democracy. Extremist groups also use terrorism, violence, and fear to push their beliefs and gain power. So just write down what's in green. Not all rebels are extremists or terrorists. That's really important to remember, is that people may want the same things or want changes to something, but they may have different ways of going about it. So not all rebels are terrorists. Many of the rebels wanted democracy. They wanted more freedoms. This is not the same as what some extreme terrorist organizations wanted, and we will not confuse the two. Syrian Civil War timeline. So from March 15th, 2011 to December 8th, 2024, there was conflict in Syria. Our main character most likely leaves Syria before 2011. So when things were maybe kind of starting to look not so great. The war peaks between 2012 and 2017 with intense fighting, but no clear winner. Okay, so the president remained the president, and the rebels didn't really lose, didn't really win. A ceasefire means they stopped fighting. They agreed to stop bombing. They agreed to stop shooting. They agreed to a time of peace temporarily in March 2020. Think about what happened in March 2020 in the world, why that might have been a necessary time for both sides to reach a ceasefire and pause their conflict. Okay, even though they did pause their conflict, there continued to be some clashes. In November of 2024, the rebel Syrian army So they called themselves a Syrian army, but they were not the government. They were rebels, threatened an attack on Aleppo and the president. So that was towards the end of last year. Al-Assad vowed to crush the rebels, but resigned and fled. So you can just write Al-Assad resigned and fled, December 8th, 2024. So he has not been in Syria. He is no longer the president of Syria. Syria doesn't have officially any new government at the time of me recording this video in January 2025. This is the latest kind of like clear update we have. It's believed that the president went to Russia, which was a key ally of his government and supported him throughout this war. You don't have to write this down, any of it, but this is a statement put out by Russia. As a result of negotiations between Assad and a number of participants in the armed conflict on the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic, he decided to resign from the presidency and left the country, giving instructions for a peaceful transfer of power. We, which is Russia, did not participate in these negotiations. So basically, they're saying, we know where he is. He has left. He is giving up his presidency, and he requests a peaceful transition of power. But at the same time, he did flee Russia because it wouldn't have been a safe place. I mean, it wasn't a safe place for him to stay. He was being attacked. Okay, Syrian refugee crisis. So because of the war, there ended up being a lot of people in Syria who sought life in new countries, even temporarily. The conflict in Syria forced many Syrians to leave their country. Some lived in United Nations refugee camps, so bullet point refugee camp. Others paid smugglers to sneak them into other countries by boat or truck. And then some immigrated to foreign countries. Bullet point, some immigrated to foreign countries. Our main character is one of these examples. She immigrated to the United States. About 14 million Syrians sought asylum, which is legal protection to remain in foreign countries because of danger at home. When things calmed in 2018, some people returned to Syria to assess the damage. Again, the war was not over in 2018, but conflict had calmed down relatively. It wasn't at the peak anymore. So write down what's in green. For the people who left the city, you actually don't need to write down anything. I'm just showing some pictures. What kinds of lives do you think they lived during the war? We're actually going to talk about this one together in class. Use 3 words to describe the contrast of the foreground. We're going to talk about this one in class too. You actually will answer these yourself in the Pear Deck if you haven't already. And then looking at this photo, what challenges may face the citizens returning to Syria? We also are going to talk about this one in class. United States involvement, what you need to know. So our government has gotten involved in conflicts in the Middle East in the past, and they did with Syria, and they're doing it with Ukraine right now, which is not a Middle Eastern country, but we're involved, and we're doing it very controversially. We're doing it in Israel and Gaza currently as well. So under President Obama, so you can just write Obama, which is when our book takes place. He blocked trade with the Syrian president. So putting pressure on the president, like, hey, we're not going to trade with you. We're not going to buy your oil. We're not going to sell you anything of ours. We're not going to give you money or weapons or anything to support you. We want you to peacefully transition to a different government. Instead, under Obama, the U.S. government provided the rebels with aid, but specifically non-weapons. So they gave food, medical supplies, shelter, and vehicles. And they work to identify potential leaders for a new Syrian government. This is not uncommon for something the CIA has done in the past, where they kind of identify people who could be in positions of power in a new democracy, and they would endorse or kind of promote those people. And then because of the terrorism threat in 2014, the US government deployed troops to fight ISIL, or sometimes they're called ISIS, a terrorist group, not the rebel groups. So we know that they're not, because the US government gave the rebels supplies, but did not, in 2014, did not give the ISIS supplies, because they're not on the same side. They may both be against the government, but they're not on the same side. Under President Trump, he phased out the U.S. program to train rebels against the Syrian government. So this is what Obama's administration had been doing to identify potential leaders and train them. Under Trump, the government kind of phased out using resources that way. He had planned to maintain a military presence in Syria without a clear timeline for withdrawal. There were times when he said he was going to pull back, but then circumstances changed, and he kept soldiers in Syria. Under President Biden, the focused U.S. involvement continues to mainly be on anti-terrorism efforts. So fighting terrorism. In 2024, they temporarily increased American troops just around the fall of the president. And one of the reasons being is that with the president out, now we have the rebels who want one solution, and there are terrorist groups that want other solutions, and there's nearby countries that would want probably to take parts of Syrian land and claim them and their people as their own, with Israel being right next to them and in a heated conflict. And there's just a lot that is uncertain in Syria right now. So the U.S. Is maintaining about 2,000 armed people in there. Okay, that is the end of these notes. You may, I think it's time to continue with the rest of lesson 2. So for you, that could be the Pear Deck. That could be the page 32 buzzwords notes. That could be read and reflect on the unwanted. That could be your quick check. So I'm guessing you're not at the quick check yet, but you may continue with wherever you're at.